The Paradise Mystery by J.S. Fletcher, Chapter 4, The Room at the Mitre. In the few seconds which elapsed before Ransford recognized Bryce's presence, Bryce took a careful, if swift, observation of his late employer. That Ransford was visibly upset by something was plain enough to see. His face was pale, he was muttering to himself. One clenched fist was pounding the open palm of the other hand. Altogether he looked like a man who was suddenly confronted with some fearful difficulty. And when Bryce, having looked long enough to satisfy his wishes, coughed gently, he started in such a fashion as to suggest that his nerves had become unstrung. "What is it? What are you doing there?" he demanded almost fiercely. "What do you mean by coming in like that?" Bryce affected to have seen nothing. "I came to fetch you," he answered. "There's been an accident in Paradise. Man fallen from that door at the head of St. Wrytha's stair. I wish you'd come, but I may as well tell you that he's past help. Dead." "Dead? A man?" exclaimed Ransford. "What man? A workman?" Bryce had already made up his mind about telling Ransford of the stranger's call at surgery. He would say nothing. At that time, at any rate. It was impossible that anyone but himself knew of the call. The side entrance to the surgery was screened from the close by a shrubbery. It was very unlikely that any passer-by had seen the man call or go away. No, he would keep his knowledge secret until it could be made better use of. "Not a workman, not a townsman, a stranger," he answered. "Looks like a well-to-do tourist. A slightly built, elderly man, grey-haired." Ransford, who had turned to his desk to master himself, looked round with a sudden sharp glance, and for the moment Bryce was taken aback, for he had condemned Ransford, and yet that glance was one of apparently genuine surprise, a glance which almost convinced him against his will, against only two evident facts, that Ransford was hearing of the Paradise affair for the first time. "An elderly man? Grey-haired? Slightly built?" said Ransford. "Dark clothes? Silk hat?" "Precisely," replied Bryce, who was now considerably astonished. "Do you know him?" "I saw such a man entering the cathedral a while ago," answered Ransford. "A stranger, certainly. Come along, then." He had fully recovered his self-possession by that time, and he led the way from the surgery and across the close as if he were going on an ordinary professional visit. He kept silence as they walked rapidly towards Paradise, and Bryce was silent too. He had studied Ransford a good deal during their 2 years' acquaintanceship, and he knew Ransford's power of repressing and commanding his feelings and concealing his thoughts, and now he decided that the look and start, which he had at first taken to be the nature of genuine astonishment, were cunningly assumed, and he was not surprised when, having reached the group of men gathered around the body, Ransford showed nothing but professional interest. "Have you done anything towards finding out who this unfortunate man is?" asked Ransford after a brief examination, as he turned to Mitchington. "Evidently a stranger, but he probably has papers on him." "There's nothing on him except a purse with plenty of money in it," answered Mitchington. "I've been through his pockets myself. There isn't a scrap of paper, not even as much as an old letter, but he's evidently a tourist, or something of the sort, and so he'll probably have stayed in the city all night, and I'm going to inquire at the hotels." "There'll be an inquest, of course," remarked Ransford mechanically. "Well, we can do nothing, Mitchington. You'd better have the body removed to the mortuary." He turned and looked up the broken stairway, at the foot of which they were standing. "You say he fell down that?" he asked. "Whatever was he doing up there?" Mitchington looked at Bryce. "Haven't you told Dr. Ransford how it was?" he asked. "No," answered Bryce. He glanced at Ransford, indicating Varner, who had come back with the constable and was standing by. "He didn't fall," he went on, watching Ransford narrowly. "He was violently flung out of that doorway. Varner here saw it." Ransford's cheek flushed, and he was unable to repress a slight start. He looked at the mason. "You actually saw it?" he exclaimed. "Why, what did you see?" "Him," answered Varner, nodding at the dead man. "Flung, head and heels, clean through that doorway up there. Hadn't a chance to save himself, he hadn't. Just grabbed at nothing and came down. Give a year's wages if I hadn't seen it and heard him scream." Ransford was watching Varner with a set, concentrated look. "Who flung him?" he asked suddenly. "You say you saw?" "Aye, sir, but not as much as all that," replied the mason. "I just saw a hand, and that was all. But," he added, turning to the police with a knowing look, "there's one thing I can swear to. It was a gentleman's hand. I saw the white shirt cuff and a bit of a black sleeve." Ransford turned away, but he just as suddenly turned back to the inspector. "You have to let the cathedral authorities know, Mitchington," he said. "Better get the body removed, though, first. Do it now, before the morning service is over, and let me hear what you find out about his identity, if you can discover anything in the city." He went away then, without another word or a further glance at the dead man. But Bryce had already assured himself of what he was certain was a fact, that a look of unmistakable relief had swept across Ransford's face for the fraction of a second when he knew that there were no papers on the dead man. He himself waited after Ransford had gone, waited until the police had fetched a stretcher, when he personally superintended the removal of the body to the mortuary outside the close, and there a constable who had come over from the police station gave a faint hint as to further investigation. "I saw that poor gentleman last night, sir," he said to the inspector. "He was standing at the door of the Mitre, talking to another gentleman, a tallish man." "Then I'll go across there," said Mitchington. "Come with me, if you like, Dr. Bryce." This was precisely what Bryce desired. He was already anxious to acquire all the information he could get, and he walked over the way with the inspector to the quaint, old-world inn which filled almost one side of the little square known as Monday Market, and in at the courtyard, where, looking out of the bow window which had served as an outer bar in the coaching days, they found the landlady of the Mitre, Mrs. Partingley. Bryce saw at once that she had heard the news. "What's this, Mr. Mitchington?" she demanded as they drew near across the cobble-paved yard. "Somebody's been in to say there's been an accident to a gentleman, a stranger. I hope it isn't one of the two we've got in the house." "I should say it is, ma'am," answered the inspector. "He was seen outside here last night by one of our men, anyway." The landlady uttered an expression of distress, and opening a side door, motioned them to step into her parlour. "Which of them is it?" she asked anxiously. "There's two came together last night, they did, a tall one and a short one. Dear, dear me, is it a bad accident now, Inspector?" "The man's dead, ma'am," replied Mitchington grimly. "And we want to know who he is. Have you got his name? And the other gentleman's?" Mrs. Partingley uttered another exclamation of distress and astonishment, lifting her plump hands in horror. But her business faculties remained alive, and she made haste to produce a big visitor's book and to spread it open before her callers. "There it is," she said, pointing to the two last entries. "That's the short gentleman's name, Mr. John Braden, London, and that's the tall one's, Mr. Christopher Dellingham, also London. Tourists, of course. We've never seen either of them before." "Came together, you say, Mrs. Partingley?" asked Mitchington. "When was that, now?" "Just before dinner last night," answered the landlady. "They'd evidently come in by the London train. That gets in at 6:40, as you know. They came here together, and they'd dinner together, and spent the evening together. Of course, we took them for friends. But they didn't go out together this morning, though they'd breakfast together. After breakfast, Mr. Dellingham asked me the way to the old Manor Mill, and he went off there, so I concluded. Mr. Braden, he hung about a bit, studying a local directory I'd lent him, and after a while he asked me if he could hire a trap to take him out to Saxonsteade this afternoon. Of course, I said he could, and he arranged for it to be ready at 2:30. Then he went out, and across the market, towards the cathedral, and that," concluded Mrs. Partingley, "is about all I know, gentlemen." "Saxonsteade, eh?" remarked Mitchington. "Did he say anything about his reasons for going there?" "Well, yes, he did," replied the landlady, "for he asked me if I thought he'd be likely to find the Duke at home at that time of day. I said I knew his Grace was at Saxonsteade just now, and that I should think the middle of the afternoon would be a good time." "He didn't tell you his business with the Duke?" asked Mitchington. "Not a word," said the landlady. "Oh, no, just that and no more. But here's Mr. Dellingham." Bryce turned to see a tall, broad-shouldered, bearded man pass the window. The door opened, and he walked in to glance inquisitively at the inspector. He turned at once to Mrs. Partingley. "I hear there's been an accident to that gentleman I came in with last night," he said. "Is it anything serious? Your ostler says—" "These gentlemen have just come about it, sir," answered the landlady. She glanced at Mitchington. "Perhaps you'll tell," she began. "Was he a friend of yours, sir?" asked Mitchington. "A personal friend?" "Never saw him in my life before last night," replied the tall man. "We just chanced to meet in the train coming down from London, got talking, and discovered we were both coming to the same place, Wrychester. So we came to this house together. No friend of mine, not even an acquaintance, previous, of course, to last night. Is anything serious?" "He's dead, sir," replied Mitchington, "and now we want to know who he is." "God bless my soul! Dead? You don't say so!" exclaimed Mr. Dellingham. "Dear, dear! Well, I can't help you. Don't know him from Adam. Pleasant, well-informed man. Seemed to have travelled a great deal in foreign countries. I can tell you this much, though," he went on, as if a sudden recollection had come to him. "I gathered that he'd only just arrived in England. In fact, now I come to think of it, he said as much. Made some remark on the train about the pleasantness of the English landscape, don't you know. I got an idea that he'd recently come from some country where trees and hedges and green fields aren't much in evidence. But if you want to know who he is, officer, why don't you search him? He's sure to have papers, cards, and so on about him." "We have searched him," answered Mitchington. "There isn't a paper, a letter, or even a visiting card on him." Mr. Dellingham looked at the landlady. "Bless me," he said. "Remarkable. But he'd a suitcase, or something of that sort, something light, which he carried up from the railway station himself. Perhaps in that." "I should like to see whatever he had," said Mitchington. "We'd better examine his room, Mrs. Partingley." Bryce presently followed the landlady and the inspector upstairs. Mr. Dellingham followed him. All four went into a bedroom which looked out on Monday Market, and there, on a side table, lay a small leather suitcase, one which could easily be carried, with its upper half thrown open and back against the wall behind. The landlady, Mr. Dellingham, and Bryce stood silently by while the inspector examined the contents of this, the only piece of luggage in the room. There was very little to see. What toilet articles the visitor brought were spread out on the dressing-table, brushes, combs, a case of razors, and the like, and Mitchington nodded sidewise at them as he began to take the articles out of the suitcase. "There's one thing strikes me at once," he said. "I dare say you gentlemen notice it. All these things are new. This suitcase hasn't been in use very long. See, the leather's almost unworn. And those things on the dressing-table are new. And what there is here looks new, too. There's not much, you see. He evidently had no intention of a long stop. An extra pair of trousers, some shirts, socks, collars, neckties, slippers, handkerchiefs. That's about all. And the first thing to do is to see if the linen's marked with name or initials." He deftly examined the various articles as he took them out, and in the end shook his head. "No name, no initials," he said. "But look here, do you see, gentlemen, where these collars were bought? 6 of them in a box. Paris. There you are, the seller's name inside the collar, just as in England. Aristide Pujol, 82 Rue des Capucines. And judging by the look of 'em, I should say these shirts were bought there too, and the handkerchiefs, and the neckwear. They all have a foreign look. There may be a clue in that. We might trace him in France, if we can't in England. Perhaps he's a Frenchman." "I'll take my oath he isn't," exclaimed Mr. Dellingham. "However long he'd been out of England, he hadn't lost a North Country accent. He was some sort of a North Countryman, Yorkshire or Lancashire, I'll go to bail. No Frenchman, officer, not he." "Well, there's no papers here, anyway," said Mitchington, who had now emptied the suitcase. "Nothing to show who he was. Nothing here, you see, in the way of paper, but this old book. What is it? History of Barthorpe." "He showed me that in the train," remarked Mr. Dellingham. "I'm interested in antiquities and archaeology, and anybody who's long in my society finds it out. We got talking of such things, and he pulled out that book and told me with great pride that he'd picked it up from a book barrow in the street, somewhere in London, for 1 6, I think," he added musingly. "That what attracted him in it was the old calf binding and the steel frontispiece. I'm sure he'd no great knowledge of antiquities." Mitchington laid the book down, and Bryce picked it up, examining the title page, and made a mental note of the fact that Barthorpe was a market town in the Midlands. And it was on the tip of his tongue to say that if the dead man had no particular interest in antiquities and archaeology, it was somewhat strange that he should have bought a book which was mainly antiquarian, and that it might be that he had so bought it because of a connection between Barthorpe and himself. But he remembered that it was his own policy to keep pertinent facts for his own private consideration, so he said nothing. And Mitchington, presently remarking that there was no more to be done there, and ascertaining from Mr. Dellingham that it was his intention to remain in Wrychester for at any rate a few days, they went downstairs again, and Bryce and the inspector crossed over to the police station. The news had spread through the heart of the city, and at the police station doors a crowd had gathered. Just inside, 2 or 3 principal citizens were talking to the superintendent. Amongst them was Mr. Stephen Folliot, the stepfather of young Bonham, a big, heavy-faced man who had been a resident in the Close for some years, was known to be of great wealth, and had a reputation as a grower of rare roses. He was telling the superintendent something, and the superintendent beckoned to Mitchington. "Mr. Folliot says he saw this gentleman in the cathedral," he said. "Can't have been so very long before the accident happened, Mr. Folliot, from what you say." "As near as I can reckon, it would be 5 minutes to 10, answered Mr. Folliot. "I put it at that because I'd gone in for the morning service, which is at 10. I saw him go up the inside stair to the clerestory gallery. He was looking about him. 5 minutes to 10, and it must have happened immediately afterwards." Bryce heard this and turned away, making a calculation for himself. It had been on the stroke of 10 when he saw Ransford hurrying out of the west porch. There was a stairway from the gallery down to that west porch. What, then, was the inference? But for the moment he drew none. Instead, he went home to his rooms in Friary Lane, and, shutting himself up, drew from his pocket the scrap of paper he had taken from the dead man. End of chapter 4.
The Paradise Mystery by J.S. Fletcher. Chapter 5. The Scrap of Paper. When Bryce, in his locked room, drew that bit of paper from his pocket, it was with a conviction that, in it, he held a clue to the secret of the morning's adventure. He had only taken a mere glance at it as he withdrew it from the dead man's purse, but he had seen enough of what was written on it to make him certain that it was a document, if such a mere fragment could be called a document, of no ordinary importance. And now he unfolded and laid it flat on his table and looked at it carefully, asking himself what was the real meaning of what he saw. There was not much to see. The scrap of paper itself was evidently a quarter of a leaf of old-fashioned, stoutish note-paper, somewhat yellow with age and bearing evidence of having been folded and kept flat in the dead man's purse for some time. The creases were well defined, the edges were worn and slightly stained by long rubbing against the leather, and in its center were a few words, or rather abbreviations of words, in Latin and some figures. In para, Wrychester, juxt, tomb, rick, jenk, excap, 23, 15. Bryce at first sight took them to be a copy of some inscription, but his knowledge of Latin told him, a moment later, that instead of being an inscription, it was a direction. And a very plain direction too. He read it easily. In Paradise, at Wrychester, next to or near the tomb of Richard Jenkins, or possibly Jenkinson, from or behind the head, 23, 15 inches most likely. There was no doubt that there was the meaning of the words. What now was it that lay behind the tomb of Richard Jenkins or Jenkinson in Wrychester Paradise? In all probability 23 inches from the headstone and 15 inches beneath the surface. That was a question which Bryce immediately resolved to find a satisfactory answer to. In the meantime, there were other questions which he set down in order of his mental tablets. They were these. Who really was the man who had registered at the Mitre under the name of John Braden? Why did he wish to make a personal call on the Duke of Saxonsteade? Was he some man who had known Ransford in time past and whom Ransford had no desire to meet again? Did Ransford meet him in the cathedral? Was it Ransford who flung him to his death down St. Wrytha's stair? Was that the real reason of the agitation in which he, Bryce, had found Ransford a few moments after the discovery of the body? There was plenty of time before him for the due solution of these mysteries, reflected Bryce, and for solving another problem which might possibly have some relationship to them, that of the exact connection between Ransford and his two wards. Bryce, in telling Ransford that morning of what was being said amongst the tea-table circles of the old cathedral city, had purposely only told him half a tale. He knew, and had known for months, that the society of the Close was greatly exercised over the possession of the Ransford menage. Ransford, a bachelor, a well-preserved, active, alert man, who was certainly of no more than middle age and did not look his years, had come to Wrychester only a few years previously, and had never shown any signs of forsaking his single state. No one had ever heard him mention his family or relations. Then, suddenly, without warning, he had brought into his house Mary Bewery, a handsome young woman of 19, who was said to have only just left school, and her brother Richard, then a boy of 16, who had certainly been at a public school of repute, and was entered at the famous Dean's School of Wrychester as soon as he came to his new home. Dr. Ransford spoke of these two as his wards without further explanation. The society of the Close was beginning to want much more explanation. Who were they, these two young people? Was Dr. Ransford their uncle, their cousin? What was he to them? In any case, in the opinion of the elderly ladies who set the tone of society in Wrychester, Miss Bewery was much too young and far too pretty to be left without a chaperone. But up to then, no one had dared to say as much to Dr. Ransford. Instead, everybody said it freely behind his back. Bryce had used eyes and ears in relation to the two young people. He had been with Ransford a year when they arrived. Admitted freely to their company, he had soon discovered that whatever relationship existed between them and Ransford, they had none with anybody else, that they knew of. No letters came for them from uncles, aunts, cousins, grandfathers, grandmothers. They appeared to have no memories or reminiscences of relatives, nor of father or mother. There was a curious atmosphere of isolation about them. They had plenty of talk about what might be called their present, their recent school days, their youthful experiences, games, pursuits, but none of what, under any circumstances, could have been a very far distant past. Bryce's quick and attentive ears discovered things. For instance, that for many years past Ransford had been in the habit of spending his annual 2 months' holiday with these two. Year after year, at any rate since the boy's 10th year, he had taken them travelling. Bryce heard scraps of reminiscences of tours in France and in Switzerland and in Ireland and in Scotland. even as far afield as the far north of Norway. It was easy to see that both boy and girl had a mighty veneration for Ransford, just as easy to see that Ransford took infinite pains to make life something more than happy and comfortable for both. And Bryce, who was one of those men who firmly believe that no man ever does anything for nothing, and that self-interest is the mainspring of life, asked himself over and over again the question which agitated the ladies of the close. Who are these two, and what is the bond between them and this sort of fairy godfather-guardian? And now, as he put away the scrap of paper in a safely locked desk, Bryce asked himself another question. Had the events of that morning anything to do with the mystery which hung round Dr. Ransford's wards? If it had, then the more reason why he should solve it. For Bryce had made up his mind that, by hook or by crook, he would marry Mary Bewery, and he was only too eager to lay hands on anything that would help him to achieve that ambition. If he could only get Ransford into his power, if he could get Mary Bewery herself into his power, well and good. Once he had got her, he would be good enough to her in his way. Having nothing to do, Bryce went out after a while and strolled round to the Rochester Club, an exclusive institution, the members of which were drawn from the leisured, the professional, the clerical, and the military circles of the old city. And there, as he expected, he found small groups discussing the morning's tragedy, and he joined one of them, in which was Sackville Bonham, his presumptive rival, who was busily telling 3 or 4 other young men what his stepfather, Mr. Folliot, had to say about the event. "My stepfather says, and I tell you, he saw the man," said Sackville, who was noted in Rochester circles as a loquacious and forward youth. "He says that whatever happened must have happened as soon as the old chap got up into the clerestory gallery. Look here, it's like this. My stepfather had gone in there for the morning service. Strict old churchgoer he is, you know, and he saw the stranger going up the stairway. He's positive, Mr. Folliot, that it was then 5 minutes to 10. Now then, I ask you, isn't he right, my stepfather, when he says that it must have happened at once immediately? Because that man, Warner, the mason, says he saw the man fall before 10. What?" One of the group nodded at Bryce. "I should think Bryce knows what time it happened as well as anybody," he said. "You were first on the spot, Bryce, weren't you?" "After Warner," answered Bryce laconically. "As to the time, I could fix it in this way. The organist was just beginning a voluntary or something of the sort." "That means 10 o'clock to the minute when he was found," exclaimed Sackville triumphantly. "Of course, he had fallen a minute or 2 before that, which proves Mr. Folliot to be right. Now what does that prove? Why, that the old chap's assailant, whoever he was, dogged him along the gallery as soon as he entered, seized him when he got to the open doorway, and flung him through, clear as noonday." One of the group, a rather older man than the rest, who was leaning back in a tilted chair, hands in pockets, watching Sackville Bonham smilingly, shook his head and laughed a little. "You're taking something for granted, Sacky, my son," he said. "You're adopting the mason's tale as true. But I don't believe the poor man was thrown through that doorway at all. Not I." Bryce turned sharply on this speaker, young Archdale, a member of a well-known firm of architects. "You don't?" he exclaimed. "But Warner says he saw him thrown." "Very likely," answered Archdale, "but it would have all happened so quickly that Warner might easily be mistaken. I'm speaking of something I know. I know every inch of the cathedral fabric. Ought to, as we're always going over it professionally. Just at that doorway, at the head of St. Rita's stair, the flooring of the clerestory gallery is worn so smooth that it's like a piece of glass, and it slopes. Slopes at a very steep angle too, to the doorway itself. A stranger walking along there might easily slip, and if the doorway was open, as it was, he'd be shot out and into the space before he knew what was happening." This theory produced a moment's silence, broken at last by Sackville Bonham. "Warner says he saw a man's hand, a gentleman's hand," insisted Sackville. "He saw a white shirt cuff, a bit of the sleeve of a coat. You're not going to get over that, you know. He's certain of it." "Warner may be as certain of it as he likes," answered Archdale almost indifferently. "And still he may be mistaken. The probability is that Warner was confused by what he saw. He may have had a white shirt cuff and the sleeve of a black coat impressed upon him as in a flash, and they were probably those of the man who was killed. If, as I suggest, the man slipped and was shot out of that open doorway, he would execute some violent and curious movements in the effort to save himself, in which his arms would play an important part. For one thing, he would certainly throw out an arm to clutch at anything. That's what Warner most probably saw. There's no evidence whatever that the man was flung down." Bryce turned away from the group of talkers to think over Archdale's suggestion. If that suggestion had a basis of fact, it destroyed his own theory that Ransford was responsible for the stranger's death. In that case, what was the reason of Ransford's unmistakable agitation on leaving the west porch, and of his attack, equally unmistakable, of nerves in the surgery? But what Archdale had said made him inquisitive, and after he had treated himself, in celebration of his freedom, to an unusually good lunch at the club, he went round to the cathedral to make a personal inspection of the gallery in the clerestory. There was a stairway to that gallery in the corner of the south transept, and Bryce made straight for it, only to find a policeman there, who pointed to a placard on the turret door. "Closed, Doctor, by order of the Dean and Chapter," he announced, "till further orders. The fact was, sir," he went on confidentially, "after the news got out, so many people came crowding in here and up to that gallery that the Dean ordered all the entrances to be shut up at once. Nobody's been allowed up since noon." "I suppose you haven't heard anything of any strange person being seen lurking about up there this morning?" asked Bryce. "No, sir, but I've had a bit of a talk with some of the workers," replied the policeman, "and they say it's a most extraordinary thing that none of them ever saw the strange gentleman go up there, nor even heard any scuffle. They say, the workers, that they were all about at the time, getting ready for the morning service, and they neither saw nor heard. Odd, sir, ain't it?" "The whole thing's odd," agreed Bryce, and he left the cathedral. He walked round to the wicket gate which admitted to that side of Paradise, to find another policeman posted there. "What? Is this closed too?" he asked. "And times, sir," said the man. "They'd broken down all the shrubs in the place if orders hadn't been given. They were mad to see where the gentleman fell. Came in crowds at dinner time." Bryce nodded and was turning away when Dick Bewery came round a corner from the Deanery Walk, evidently keenly excited. With him was a girl of about his own age, a certain characterful young lady whom Bryce knew as Betty Campany, daughter of the librarian to the Dean and Chapter, and therefore custodian of one of the most famous cathedral libraries in the country. She too was apparently brimming with excitement, and her pretty and vivacious face puckered itself into a frown as the policeman smiled and shook his head. "Oh, I say, what's that for?" exclaimed Dick Bewery. "Shut up! What a lot of rot, I say! Can't you let us go in, just for a minute?" "Not for a pension, sir," answered the policeman good-naturedly. "Don't you see the notice? The Dean would have me out of the force by tomorrow if I disobeyed orders. No admittance, nowhere, nohow. But law bless you," he added, glancing at the two young people, "there's nothing to see, nothing, as Dr. Bryce there can tell you." Dick, who knew nothing of the recent passages between his guardian and the dismissed assistants, glanced at Bryce with interest. "You were on the spot first, weren't you?" he asked. "Do you think it was really murder?" "I don't know what it was," answered Bryce, "and I wasn't first on the spot. That was Warner, the mason. He called me." He turned from the lad to glance at the girl, who was peeping curiously over the gate into the yews and cypresses. "Do you think your father's at the library now?" he asked. "Shall I find him there?" "I should think he is," answered Betty Campany. "He generally goes down about this time." She turned and pulled Dick Bewery's sleeve. "Let's go up into the clerestory," she said. "We can see that, anyway." "All so close, miss," said the policeman, shaking his head. "No admittance there neither. The public firmly warned off, so to speak. I won't have the cathedral turned into a peep show. That's precisely what I heard the dean say with my own ears. So, closed." The boy and the girl turned away and went off across the close, and the policeman looked after them and laughed. "Lively young couple, that, sir," he said. "What they call healthy curiosity, I suppose. Plenty of that knocking round in the city today." Bryce, who had half turned in the direction of the library, at the other side of the close, turned round again. "Do you know if your people are doing anything about identifying the dead man?" he asked. "Did you hear anything at noon?" "Nothing but that there'll be inquiries through the newspapers, sir," replied the policeman. "That's the surest way of finding something out. And I did hear Inspector Mitchington say that they'd have to ask the Duke if he knew anything about the poor man. I suppose he'd let fall something about wanting to go over to Saxonsteade." Bryce went off in the direction of the library, thinking. Newspapers? Yes, no better channel for spreading the news. If Mr. John Braden had relations and friends, they would learn of his sad death through the newspapers and would come forward. And in that case... "But it wouldn't surprise me," mused Bryce, "if the name given at the Mitre is an assumed name. I wonder if that theory of Archdale's is a correct one. However, there'll be more of that at the inquest tomorrow, and in the meantime let me find out something about the tomb of Richard Jenkins or Jenkinson, whoever he was." The famous library of the Dean and Chapter of Rochester was housed in an ancient picturesque building in one corner of the close, wherein day in and day out, amidst priceless volumes and manuscripts, huge folios and weighty quartos, old prints and relics of the medieval ages, Ambrose Campany, the librarian, was pretty nearly always to be found, ready to show his treasures to the visitors and tourists who came from all parts of the world to see a collection well known to bibliophiles. And Ambrose Campany, a cheery-faced, middle-aged man with book-lover and antiquary written all over him, shock-headed, blue-spectacled, was there now, talking to an old man whom Bryce knew as a neighbour of his in Friary Lane, one Simpson Barker, a quiet, meditative old fellow, believed to be a retired tradesman who spent his time in gentle pottering about the city. Bryce, as he entered, caught what Campany was just then saying. "The most important thing I've heard about it," said Campany, "is that book they found in the man's suitcase at the Mitre. I'm not a detective, but there's a clue."
The Paradise Mystery by J.S. Fletcher. Chapter 6 by Misadventure. Old Simpson Harker, who sat near the librarian's table, his hands folded on the crook of his stout walking-stick, glanced out of a pair of unusually shrewd and bright eyes at Bryce as he crossed the room and approached the pair of gossipers. "I think the doctor was there when that book you're speaking of was found," he remarked. "So I understood from Mitchington." "Yes, I was there," said Bryce, who was not unwilling to join in the talk. He turned to Campany. "What makes you think there's a clue in that?" he asked. "Why, this," answered the librarian. "Here's a man in possession of an old history of Barthorpe. Barthorpe is a small market town in the Midlands, Leicestershire, I believe, of no particular importance that I know of, but doubtless with a story of its own. Why should anyone but a Barthorpe man, past or present, be interested in that story so far as to carry an old account of it with him? Therefore, I conclude this stranger was a Barthorpe man, and it's at Barthorpe that I should make inquiries about him." Simpson Harker made no remark, and Bryce remembered what Mr. Dellingham had said when the book was found. "Oh, I don't know," he replied carelessly. "I don't see that follows. I saw the book, a curious old binding and queer old copper plates. The man may have picked it up for that reason. I've bought old books myself for less." "All the same," retorted Campany, "I should make inquiry at Barthorpe. You've got to go on probabilities. The probabilities in this case are that the man was interested in the book because it dealt with his own town." Bryce turned away towards a wall on which hung a number of charts and plans of Wrychester Cathedral and its precincts. It was to inspect one of these that he had come to the library. But suddenly remembering that there was a question which he could ask without exciting any suspicion or surmise, he faced round again on the librarian. "Isn't there a register of burials within the cathedral?" he inquired. "Some book in which they're put down? I was looking in the Memorial of Wrychester the other day, and I saw some names I want to trace." Campany lifted his quill pen and pointed to a case of big leather-bound volumes in a far corner of the room. "Third shelf from the bottom, Doctor," he replied. "You'll see 2 books there. One's the register of all burials within the cathedral itself up to date, the other's the register of those in Paradise and the cloisters. What names are you wanting to trace?" But Bryce affected not to hear the last question. He walked over to the place which Campany had indicated, and taking down the second book carried it to an adjacent table. Campany called across the room to him. "You'll find useful indexes at the end," he said. "They're all brought up to the present time, from 400 years ago nearly." Bryce turned to the index at the end of his book, an index written out in various styles of handwriting. And within a minute he found the name he wanted. There it was plainly before him. Richard Jenkins, died March 8, 1715, buried in Paradise March 10th. He nearly laughed aloud at the ease with which he was tracing out what at first had seemed a difficult matter to investigate. But lest his task should seem too easy, he continued to turn over the leaves of the big folio, and in order to have an excuse if the librarian should ask him any further questions, he memorized some of the names which he saw. And after a while he took the book back to its shelf, and turned to the wall on which the charts and maps were hung. There was one there of Paradise, whereon was marked the site and names of all the tombs and graves in that ancient enclosure. From it he hoped to ascertain the exact position and whereabouts of Richard Jenkins' grave. But here Bryce met his first check. Down each side of the old chart, dated 1850, there was a tabulated list of the tombs in Paradise. The names of families and persons were given in this list. Against each name was a number corresponding with the same number, marked on the various divisions of the chart. And there was no Richard Jenkins on that list. He went over it carefully, twice, thrice. It was not there. Obviously, if the tomb of Richard Jenkins, who was buried in Paradise in 1715, was still there, amongst the cypresses and yew trees, the name and inscription on it had vanished, worn away by time and weather, when the chart had been made 135 years later. And in that case, what did the memorandum mean which Bryce had found in the dead man's purse? He turned away at last from the chart, at a loss, and Campany glanced at him. "Found what you wanted?" he asked. "Oh, yes," replied Bryce, primed with a ready answer. "I just wanted to see where the Spellbanks were buried. Quite a lot of them, I see." "Southeast corner of Paradise," said Campany. "Several tombs. I could have spared you the trouble of looking." "You're a regular encyclopedia about the place," laughed Bryce. "I suppose you know every spout and gargoyle." "Ought to," answered the librarian. "I've been fed on it, man and boy, for 45 years." Bryce made some fitting remark and went out and home to his rooms, there to spend most of the ensuing evening in trying to puzzle out the various mysteries of the day. He got no more light on them then, and he was still exercising his brains on them when he went to the inquest next morning, to find the coroner's court packed to the doors with an assemblage of townsfolk just as curious as he was. And as he sat there listening to the preliminaries, and to the evidence of the first witnesses, his active and scheming mind figured to itself, not without much cynical amusement, how a word or two from his lips would go far to solve matters. He thought of what he might tell, if he told all the truth. He thought of what he might get out of Ransford if he, Bryce, were coroner or solicitor, and had Ransford in that witness box. He would ask him on his oath if he knew that dead man, if he had had dealings with him in times past, if he had met and spoken to him on that eventful morning. He would ask him point blank if it was not his hand that had thrown him to his death. But Bryce had no intention of making any revelations just then. As for himself, he was going to tell just as much as he pleased and no more. And so he sat and heard, and knew from what he heard that everybody there was in a hopeless fog, and that in all that crowd there was but one man who had any real suspicion of the truth, and that man was himself. The evidence given in the first stages of the inquiry was all known to Bryce and to most people in the court already. Mr. Dellingham told how he had met the dead man in the train, journeying from London to Wrychester. Mrs. Partingley told how he had arrived at the Mitre, registered in her book as Mr. John Braden, and had next morning asked if he could get a conveyance for Saxonsteade in the afternoon, as he wished to see the Duke. Mr. Folliot testified to having seen him in the cathedral, going towards one of the stairways leading to the gallery. Varner, most important witness of all up to that point, told of what he had seen. Bryce himself, followed by Ransford, gave medical evidence. Mitchington told of his examination of the dead man's clothing and effects in his room at the Mitre. And Mitchington added the first information which was new to Bryce. "In consequence of finding the book about Barthorpe in the suit-case," said Mitchington, "we sent a long telegram yesterday to the police there, telling them what had happened, and asking them to make the most careful inquiries at once about any townsman of theirs of the name of John Braden, and to wire us the result of such inquiries this morning. This is their reply, received by us an hour ago. Nothing whatever is known at Barthorpe, which is a very small town, of any person of that name." So much for that, thought Bryce. He turned with more interest to the next witness, the Duke of Saxonsteade, the great local magnate, a big bluff man who had been present in court since the beginning of the proceedings, in which he was manifestly highly interested. It was possible that he might be able to tell something of moment. He might, after all, know something of this apparently mysterious stranger, who, for anything that Mrs. Partingley or anybody else could say to the contrary, might have had an appointment and business with him. But his Grace knew nothing. He had never heard the name of John Braden in his life, so far as he remembered. He had just seen the body of the unfortunate man, and had looked carefully at the features. He was not a man of whom he had any knowledge whatever. He could not recollect ever having seen him anywhere at any time. He knew literally nothing of him, could not think of any reason at all why this Mr. John Braden should wish to see him. "Your Grace has no doubt had any business dealings with a good many people at one time or another," suggested the coroner. "Some of them, perhaps, with men whom your Grace only saw for a brief space of time, a few minutes possibly. You don't remember ever seeing this man in that way?" "I'm credited with having an unusually good memory for faces," answered the Duke, "and, if I may say so, rightly. But I don't remember this man at all. In fact, I'd go as far as to say that I'm positive I've never, knowingly, set eyes on him in my life." "Can your Grace suggest any reason at all why he should wish to call on you?" asked the coroner. "None. But then," replied the Duke, "there might be many reasons, unknown to me, but at which I can make a guess. If he was an antiquary, there are lots of old things at Saxonsteade which he might wish to see. Or he might be a lover of pictures. Our collection is a bit famous, you know. Perhaps he was a bookman. We have some rare editions. I could go on multiplying reasons, but to what purpose?" "The fact is, your Grace doesn't know him and knows nothing about him," observed the coroner. "Just no, nothing," agreed the Duke, and stepped down again. It was at this stage that the coroner sent the jurymen away in charge of his officer to make a careful personal inspection of the gallery in the clerestory. And while they were gone there was some commotion caused in the court by the entrance of a police official, who conducted to the coroner a middle-aged, well-dressed man, whom Bryce at once set down as a London commercial magnate of some quality. Between the new arrival and the coroner an interchange of remarks was at once made, shared in presently by some of the officials at the table. And when the jury came back the stranger was at once ushered into the witness-box, and the coroner turned to the jury and the court. "We are unexpectedly able to get some evidence of identity, gentlemen," he observed. "The gentleman who has just stepped into the witness-box is Mr. Alexander Chilstone, manager of the London and Colonies Bank in Threadneedle Street. Mr. Chilstone saw particulars of this matter in the newspapers this morning, and he at once set off to Wrychester to tell us what he knows of the dead man. We are very much obliged to Mr. Chilstone, and when he has been sworn he will perhaps kindly tell us what he can." In the midst of the murmur of sensation which ran round the court, Bryce indulged himself with a covert look at Ransford, who was sitting opposite to him, beyond the table in the centre of the room. He saw at once that Ransford, however strenuously he might be fighting to keep his face under control, was most certainly agitated by the coroner's announcement. His cheeks had paled, his eyes were a little dilated, his lips parted as he started at the bank manager. Altogether, it was more than mere curiosity that was indicated on his features. And Bryce, satisfied and secretly elated, turned to hear what Mr. Alexander Chilstone had to tell. That was not much, but it was of considerable importance. Only 2 days before, said Mr. Chilstone, that was, on the day previous to his death, Mr. John Braden had called at the London and Colonies Bank, of which he, Mr. Chilstone, was manager, and introducing himself as having just arrived in England from Australia, where, he said, he had been living for some years, had asked to be allowed to open an account. He produced some references from agents of the London and Colonies Bank in Melbourne, which were highly satisfactory. The account being opened, he paid into it a sum of £10,000 in a draft at sight drawn by one of those agents. He drew nothing against this, remarking casually that he had plenty of money in his pocket for the present. He did not even take the cheque-book which was offered him, saying that he would call for it later. "He did not give us any address in London or in England," continued the witness. "He told me that he had only arrived at Charing Cross that very morning, having travelled from Paris during the night. He said that he should settle down for a time at some residential hotel in London, and in the meantime he had 1 or 2 calls or visits to make in the country. When he returned from them, he said, he would call on me again. He gave me very little information about himself. It was not necessary, for his references from our agents in Australia were quite satisfactory. But he did mention that he had been out there for some years, and had speculated in landed property. He also said that he was now going to settle in England for good. That," concluded Mr. Chilstone, "is all I can tell of my own knowledge. But," he added, drawing a newspaper from his pocket, "here is an advertisement which I noticed in this morning's Times as I came down. You will observe," he said, as he passed it to the coroner, "that it has certainly been inserted by our unfortunate customer." The coroner glanced at a marked passage in the personal column of the Times, and read it aloud. "The advertisement is as follows," he announced. "If this meets the eye of old friend Marco, he will learn that Sticker wishes to see him again. Write J. Braden, A.O. London and Colonies Bank, Threadneedle Street, London." Bryce was keeping a quiet eye on Ransford. Was he mistaken in believing that he saw him start, that he saw his cheek flush as he heard the advertisement read out? He believed he was not mistaken, but if he was right, Ransford the next instant regained full control of himself and made no sign. And Bryce turned again to coroner and witness. But the witness had no more to say, except to suggest that the bank's Melbourne agents should be cabled to for information, since it was unlikely that much more could be got in England. And with that the middle stage of the proceedings ended, and the last one came, watched by Bryce with increasing anxiety. For it was soon evident, from certain remarks made by the coroner, that the theory which Archdale had put forward at the club in Bryce's hearing the previous day had gained favour with the authorities, and that the visit of the jurymen to the scene of the disaster had been intended by the coroner to predispose them in behalf of it. And now Archdale himself, as representing the architects who held a retaining fee in connection with the cathedral, was called to give his opinion, and he gave it in almost the same words which Bryce had heard him use 24 hours previously. After him came the master mason, expressing the same decided conviction, that the real truth was that the pavement of the gallery had at that particular place become so smooth, and was inclined towards the open doorway at such a sharp angle, that the unfortunate man had lost his footing on it, and before he could recover it had been shot out of the arch and over the broken head of St. Ryther's Stair. And though at a juryman's wish Varner was recalled, and stuck stoutly to his original story of having seen a hand, which he protested was certainly not that of the dead man, it soon became plain that the jury shared the coroner's belief that Varner in his fright and excitement had been mistaken, and no one was surprised when the foreman, after a very brief consultation with his fellows, announced a verdict of death by misadventure. "So the city's cleared of the stain of murder," said a man who sat next to Bryce. "That's a good job, anyway. Nasty thing, Doctor, to think of a murder being committed in a cathedral. There'd be a question of sacrilege, of course, and all sorts of complications." Bryce made no answer. He was watching Ransford, who was talking to the coroner. And he was not mistaken now. Ransford's face bore all the signs of infinite relief. From what? Bryce turned to leave the stuffy, rapidly emptying court. And as he passed the centre table he saw old Simpson Harker, who, after sitting in attentive silence for 3 hours, had come up to it, picked up the history of Barthorpe, which had been found in Braden's suitcase, and was inquisitively peering at its title page. End of chapter 7.